Finally, there needs to be leadership from the political center and the development of national anti-IFF action plans and coordination schema for government agencies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, William. And this is a very nice way to start off this session in terms of just painting a very big, broad brush picture of exactly what is happening at the continental level in terms of trying to stem illicit financial flows from the continent, but as well as the very salient and specific issues that pose challenges in terms of lack of participation, lack of involvement of several African governments in some of these global processes, but that are hampering the fight against illicit financial flows from the continent. And at this juncture, I'd like to maybe just start off the conversation with Salimata, if I may. William talked about the issues around the extractive sector and the issues around transparency and the role of transparency and transfer pricing audits that have been done. Could you please tell us a little bit about what sorry. More about the perspective from the African Development Bank when it comes to natural resource governance and how that feeds into the conversation around illicit financial flows, given that the high-level panel did identify the sector as being one of the major sectors generating illicit financial flows. But at the same time, the sector is also considered one of the most important sectors in kickstarting or being the engine of growth for the continent.
Hello, Jason, I'm wondering why you keep starting by me. Okay, I will try to speak in English this time, if you don't mind, and allow me to switch into French if I have some difficulty, right? Thank you. Okay, so the question, yes, Jason, study has shown a notable portion of illicit financial flows are generated through extractive industry, which is a very highly regulated sector, we can say. That's one. And for the AFDB, we have the 10-year strategy and various policy, various strategy document that place renewed emphasis on natural resource management as a transformational platform. Okay. Again, the strategy emphasizes on how natural resources can deliver inclusive growth by widening access to resources and improving the efficiency and the sustainability of natural assets. That's one. And I do not see contradiction here in these two findings or statement, because natural resource can be an important growth driver if it is well managed. Though the scale of illicit financial flows from Africa shows what we can say a failure in natural resource governance, but not closing the loophole through which these leakages occur. And the existence of illicit financial flow does not diminish the, what we call, the strategic importance of African natural resources. So this will rather challenge government and other stakeholders to minimize and or to completely eliminate these illicit financial flows and other linkages in order to maximize the economic and development potential from this natural resource extraction. And I do believe maybe all of us, we believe that if progress will be made in the global fight against illicit financial flows, we need to focus on improving integrity and transparency in a sector, the sector of extractive industry, which is particularly vulnerable to corruption. We need really to make some improvement on that sector. So again, the bank capacity to address the natural resource governance, as I said yesterday, has been significantly enhanced by the establishment of this center, which I mentioned yesterday. And the center is working and will work again with other department of the bank, namely, mainly the Department of Governance of the bank, which is really leading all this governance issue, and the Department of the Integrity and Anti-Corruption. We have the whole department of the bank sitting there, and they have other issue. They also have those work on operation and non-sovereign operation on all this integrity and anti-corruption area. So together with other department and as a partner also, the center has enhanced the bank work on this issue. So what the center is doing now, the center will advise on policy and on frameworks to ensure that natural resources support inclusive growth. And so just for now, saying that this is not contradictory, we just need to do some more work for an inclusive growth of natural resources in the continent.
Great, thank you very much, Salimata. I think that it's very important for us to consider how the different multilateral institutions on the continent are providing these entry points, providing these sources of interventions against illicit financial flows. And I think at this point, maybe if I may come to Don, just to give us a little bit more of an insight into the different instruments that are out here on the continent. William mentioned quite a few of them in his presentation, but in particular, I think the Africa Union's Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, the AU recently asked for the high-level panel recommendations to be incorporated or embedded within this convention. How do these different instruments work together in terms of allowing the continent to be in a position to actually start setting its own goals, start setting its own global norms and global positions on these issues, as opposed to the more prescriptive approach that William had described in terms of things not being at the table when some of these interventions or some of these instruments are being developed?
Thank you, Jason. I think the question forces us to be even briefer than we wanted, which is a good thing, to democratize the conversation. In the session I was in the morning, which screened a series of videos that, documentary, called The Profiteers, showing illicit financial flows arising out of corruption and impunity being undertaken in South Sudan and being laundered through principally Uganda and Kenya. One of the panelists, an economist, said something very important, that it is not a shortage of laws that puts us where we are. Certainly, there are legal provisions that can be improved, and we spoke about that yesterday, but it's not a shortage of laws. It is more a shortage of implementation, a culture of impunity. And I think that's important to raise here, Jason, and not necessarily to repeat what Will has done, which is to bring out the importance of the Anti-Corruption Convention, but also the constellation within the Anti-Corruption Convention sits, that has a human rights charter, has a democracy, elections and governance charter, has a women's rights charter, and so on. So there are instruments there. And the question is more how we are able to hold each other to account in terms of implementing the commitments that the states have made for us within those instruments. Within the AU, for instance, there's the anti-corruption body, yes, and we've talked about it. It sits within something known as AGA, the African Governance Architecture, which is a very deliberate policy directive and a legal obligation on the various AU organs and institutions to work with each other. So the framework is there where they're being told the court in Arusha, the anti-corruption body in Arusha, the Human Rights Commission in Banjul, the Gambia, the Child Rights Committee in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the Pan-African Parliament in Midrand in South Africa, and the Addis Ababa-based institutions should be working together. So I think it's a challenge of how we get that done. And many times when we get here, people talk of political will. And I, Chair, think sometimes political will is too big a word. Once you say political will, it just sounds, it's too big and too disempowering and so on. And I think it's more about how we break it down into its constituent components and then say, in each situation, which of the following are manifesting themselves and how do we address? Because there's still a lot of ignorance. Many government officials and many citizens on the ground do not know what we have committed to. And we're not lying. You could very well have built capacity within the National Anti-Corruption Commission or within the Office for Legal Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a particular country on this issue of corruption, or on the issue of women's empowerment and gender equality, and then the gentleman or lady gets promoted and moves to a different department, ministry, department, or agency, and it is gone and we're back to square one. So ignorance is big. And sometimes even when there is some knowledge, there's still a culture of working in silos. So me, I just know what I'm supposed to do, it is this, and I'm not going to work with the other. Budget is a big issue, that we are not allocating enough budgets to issues that need to be resolved in a particular way. And that's not surprising. We know our countries are broke. We know the AU is broke. But budget is an issue by itself that one needs to look at. And then human resource capacity. At the AU, and even in our member states, you come across these one-person departments. So when the person is sick, the department is sick. When the person has malaria, the department has malaria. When the person is on maternity leave, the department is on maternity leave. So that becomes, for us, I think, a big issue that needs to be addressed. Then generally, our culture of big talk and little action that needs to be addressed by itself. So you've had the old joke that our European counterparts are very conservative on text, but very robust on implementation. And to the contrary, in our part, we are very bombastic on text, and then very diminutive on implementation. So that culture for, I think, itself to be addressed. And then finally, just impunity. And I don't think we need to repeat to each other. If you look at the sessions we had in the morning, it says that in addition to what we've been doing, which brought us here, which really is quite a start already, 20 years ago, the idea of civil society did not exist in most African countries. So this is a big journey to get to this point. But in what ways can we work together anew, building on what we're already doing, to really confront the bull of impunity by its head? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don, for putting that. And I think it's a very nice segue to Valerie, just to get your take on a very specific component of what Don has talked about, but also what William presented on the anti-money laundering aspects. William talked about the several African governments having signed up or established FATF-type administrations, but also the level of implementation in terms of how the setup has been done, and keeping in mind the challenges that Don has mentioned. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you think then could be an alternative to that?
Okay, so I think Jason has kind of put me on the spot because he has asked a question which is outside our discussion, but nevertheless, I'll attempt it. So first of all, I think the first thing I would want us to establish is that we've been saying that African countries are not complying. And the question is, to what extent are African countries in reality not compliant. So what I did in preparation for my presentation today was that I basically took an aggregate of all the mutual evaluation reports on 38 African countries. And in looking at these reports, what I did was to find out the level of compliance. And what these reports basically told me, because I recorded them into numbers and then changed them into percentages, it basically showed that of the 38 African countries, only 8 African countries have indeed reached above 50% compliance, with only Egypt reaching 62% compliance. Now, the rest of the other African countries were targeting between 28 to 50% compliance. So this, in fact, tells us that African countries are not compliant. But then again, what's the benchmark for compliance? Is it 50%? Is it 10%? To what extent can you say African countries are complying? So moving from that, now, talking about the issues that African countries have faced and going back to the topic of discussion, the challenges that African countries have in complying, again, we'll talk about capacity challenges. I'm not going to reiterate on that because Don has given a fantastic discussion on that already. So there are capacity challenges in African countries. You have that with both the indirect and direct gatekeepers. So you have that with legislatures. With legislation, although I know Don mentioned that our legislations are fantastic, but I beg to differ, because you see that there's the way money laundering works is that there are always new techniques to launder money, and so laws have to catch up. The FATF recommendations in itself has changed. There's been reviews, I think, about 3 times or so. So you see that even countries then have to adapt that, because again, we have to acknowledge the fact that there are new techniques on board. Now, moving on from that, you see bank officials not having the capacity. You then see regulatory arbitrage, particularly as regards the regulatory bodies. And by that, I mean that because regulatory bodies are strapped of resources, they are strapped of capacity, and they are strapped of, they have limited knowledge, what you then see is that these regulatory bodies then depend on the government or depend on other financial institutions to basically fund them. And in that sense, in who are they, who then are the regulators? That's basically what I mean by that. Again, Don touched on political will as one of the issues. Now, again, I agree that it is an elusive concept, but I think that it can be contextually defined. So for the purpose of this presentation, what I basically did is to define it as the extent of committed support amongst key decision makers for a particular policy solution to a particular problem. Now, if you look at our budgets, if you look at the determination of various government bodies, if you look at the drive of civil societies, if you look at human resource management, all of those things are done fantastically already mentioned, you would realize that we do not necessarily have the political will needed to drive compliance within African countries. Now, practicalizing that, let's say, for instance, there's this former central bank governor, and what he basically said was that when he tried to go after some CEOs, bank CEOs, he was told if you go after them, they would kill you, they would catch you, and you would be sacked. So don't do it. So what you basically see is that, and he was told this because he had these CEOs had basically funded a lot of political parties. So what then you then see is that there's an interrelationship between head of financial institutions and governments, and this undermines the ability of countries to actually comply. Now, okay. Now, as I discussed with Jason earlier, there's not just the internal issues, there are also external issues to compliance. So external issues can be, for instance, the external pressure to transplant and comply, which is basically done through sanctions. A lot of African countries have been sanctioned, and we don't see that these African countries decide to comply or to take on laws, transplant, should I say, that's the word, to transplant words basically to replicate recorded successes or as a mere symbolic action. But the question is, to what extent can you actually transplant? I believe that law is contextual. It's contextual to space and time. It's contextual to socioeconomic situations. So to that extent, I believe that transplantation is a farce. Again, a lot of people might beg to differ, but that is the stand I take. I do not believe that law is culture neutral. So to that extent, it's almost as if African countries have been deliberately set up to fail. And their ability to comply is basically stifled from the start. Let's take, for instance, complying CDD recommendations. That's an easy one. Yes, there are CDD recommendations, but to what extent can African countries comply to that, particularly in a country where people are marginalized out of the financial institutions? So you're basically pushing these people further away, pushing them into the informal sector, and enabling them carry out money laundering or whatever activities outside the space of regulation.
Great. Thank you very much, Valerie. And I think your last point actually is brilliant, because it's a very nice way to bring in Dr. Shabalala, because the idea of transplanting something from elsewhere and then putting it or imposing it onto governments for compliance, for implementation, is something that seems to be an all too familiar narrative on our continent. And I also want to pick up on the very nice definition that Valerie gave on political will, that is the extent to which there is a committed support to a particular intervention. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts, Dr. Shabalala, on how this affects the narrative of our legislators, of our policymakers, of our decision makers, when it comes to trying to address the issue of illicit financial flows, but also the very pervasive nature of corruption that goes beyond just abuse of power.
Thanks, Jason. I almost said I'm always the devil's advocate, and then I remembered that I actually don't believe in the devil, so I don't know. I think I'm just a provocateur. I think I'll live with that one. I think in answering you, I just want to paint a picture. If you were dealing with drugs in your area, an influx of drugs, and you knew exactly who the two godfathers were, and their hitmen are the ones selling the drugs and killing people, who do you want to tackle? The hitmen and leave the godfather intact, because the more hitmen you kill, the more the godfather will employ more hitmen, because the godfather has the money and the resources? Or do you want to go beyond the hitmen and actually tackle the godfather? I think that becomes my dilemma when we deal with African countries. That behind every corrupt to the core African president or minister, there's an even triple corrupt European sitting somewhere. The Chinese have joined now. Now, are we tackling these hitmen called our governments, or do we want to deal with the godfathers too? As a Pan-African, I think my conscience just does not allow me to deal with the hitmen and leave the godfathers like they are not doing anything. So I put this slide because I just want you to take a moment and look at this. This bothers me, and if it doesn't bother you as an African, then maybe we must just pack and go home. Then the 2 days really, for me, was a waste. Because the people that are doing business in Africa are the same people that are now planting military bases all over these continents, right under our noses, and we are not even having that discussion. We talk about illicit financial flows. It is a war, by the way. It's economic liberation. IFFs are a war. But we talk about them as if there's not going to be any backlash against any committed government, Jason, that wants to take these statutes we are talking about and actually implement them. They will be taken out in broad daylight. But what worries me as a person that comes from the military is that we are not just giving them foreign bases. 7 African countries, and Kenya is one of them. We are now even giving them drone bases. You know how drones work? Ask northern Pakistanis. They don't have to do what they did in Saudi Arabian embassy, where there's blood on their hands. They can just send a drone in your wedding party and take you out if they think that we are becoming too serious about the liberation of this continent. So I think for me, I want to play that provocateur role, Jason, and say, when are we going to start linking the fight for illicit financial flows and tax justice to radical economic transformation, but also to neo-colonialism, because it is colonialism. I know it's a worldwide scourge, but again, like everything else, like HIV, we suffer it the most because of the system of international relations. So I'll just say this and then I'll give the mic back to you. I can answer questions. You see, you need to sit and answer this for yourself as an African. What is the system that rules the world? Is it realism or is it idealism? Remember, idealism is the one that says nations have a national sovereignty, a right to territorial integrity, they have self-determination, people elect the leaders who they want, the system is transparent and what have you. That's realism. Sorry, that's idealism. Then you have realism. Realism says, I will protect my interest, I don't care how. If it means going into Libya and reducing Libya to an 18th world country, that's what I will do to protect my interest. That's realist. Now, if the world is in realism, when are we going to snap out of our comfort zone and stop talking about political will? I agree with the two speakers. I think that referred to it. Let's snap out of talking about political will and ask ourselves sitting here, are you prepared to die for the fight against illicit financial flows and tax? Because it will get you killed. And if you are not employed by NGO like me, you're an MP, are you prepared to be expelled by your party because we are raising issues of political finance corruption? So I think before we even take it to our governments, can we answer it to ourselves? This is war. This is not a game. I think we lose sight of it when we sit in these conferences and we drink bottled water. And we think that, no, this conversation we shall win through computers. This is a war. It's a revolution.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Shabalala. It is a war, definitely. And with that in mind, I'd like to open up, because I'm just looking at the clock and it's running really, really quick. I'd like to open up for questions, and I think there should be some mics moving around. But so we'll start with Alex, Brian. Yes, you can ask. You can definitely ask. So we've got 2 questions in the front. Okay, 3 in the front. We've got Aditola. Any at the back? All the guys and people who have had a really good lunch. Yes, Yannick. So we've got 3 questions. They're all men. So I really, this is not good. Okay, yes, Asha, that's great. So we'll start with Alex. We'll then go to Aditola, Brian, Yannick, and then Asha. So we'll take the first round of questions. Again, if you could direct them to specific individuals, if that is possible, that would be great.
Good day. My name is Alexander. I don't know that my comment sort of is a question, but it's something everyone has touched upon from different perspectives. But my focus is more asking a simple question of what are we doing to equip ourselves with the necessary tools to fight the war, as Dr. Shabalala said. And this is important from an African perspective, that we need to evolve to where we have a unified voice on a lot of tax issues. So take, for example, illicit financial flows and the definition of illicit financial flows. While we've seen discussions by CGDs and ICTDs and the other global north people on what IFFs are and if tax avoidance will constitute that, I have not read anything from any African-based organization on what that definition is and whether tax avoidance is there. Now, it's important that we do, simply because the commercial aspect of IFFs is more than 60% of it. And so if we allow the global north to successfully take away tax avoidance from the definition of IFFs, then we've taken away almost 60% of the volume of IFFs that we're talking about. And then we focus on issues of corruption, we focus on that. The second reason why it's important, why the definition is important, is IFFs are included in the SGDs, which give them political strength. And the moment, again, as I said, we don't achieve that, then it becomes a problem. So this is something like we should all think about, is to create an African, I don't know if it's an African research body or whatever it is, but somebody that helps us to always come up with an African position on many issues. Another example again, you take a transfer pricing guidelines. The OECD says that we've looked at unitary tax and formulary apportionment, and they don't work. For who? For Africans, for Asians, for Americans, who don't they work for? No African literature on whether transfer pricing works or whether unitary taxation would work. So I think that is where we should move, as Donat said, we should move from text and lots of discussions like these to implementation, to say, can we now start working specifically on these tax issues and providing our views on what they are. And I think that way we can equip ourselves with the tools to fight the war that Doctor referred to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very interesting presentation across board. I just had 2 questions. The first has to do with the CFTA negotiations. the Continental Free Trade Agreement negotiations. The rounds on investment and intellectual property just began. I'm part of that round. And it's going to be either be a strong tool or a strong problem, right? Because what it means is that it will move a lot of multinational companies to international companies within Africa, which means that it becomes a lot easier to actually move money around, right? So it actually might become one of the most exciting tools for a transnational company to actually use for illicit financial flows. I can easily move money from a complicated or a company that's even complying and move it to a more accommodating country. I won't mention names now, but I can if a country starts complying, I can move from an Egypt to say a Mauritius and just get my money out quickly. And so that means, and I do not hear any conversations, and I've been in most of negotiations of the CFTA, I do not hear any conversations around tools and frameworks and collaboration across Africa for illicit financial flows and IFFs more general. So I think that's one thing I wanted to bring to the board, that we're talking about the things that should happen, but right now one of the biggest negotiations about that is happening, and we're not lending our voice to creating the structure at the back of that. The second question I wanted to ask is there any conversation around not just international cooperation now, but African state cooperation, right? So Nkechi set out some data around compliance levels. Is there some extent a monitoring type system that you could put in place to ensure that you're monitoring everyone across board? But beyond that, it could even start a competitive process. I know that's one of the things that started with human rights in Africa a while back, where you could almost name and shame. Sorry. Where you could almost where you could almost name and shame countries that were not complying with the human rights obligations. And so what started happening was there was a race by countries to at least on the surface comply, right? So is there that conversation about African countries collaborating across board, but beyond the collaboration, also a system that monitors what everybody's doing, puts out a rap sheet on saying who is complying, who is not complying, name and shame if possible. I think that would do a lot of work in helping countries stand up, because it's like ease of doing business. I can easily say I'm not complying because I want to keep my ease of doing business indicators. So is there something like that that you can put across board in Africa that then becomes an easier way for countries to use as a defense? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There are 5 planes of struggle that are going on at the same time. So for you, Dr. Shabalala, there's a narrative, ideas, knowledge component, which is about decolonizing the IFF debate and resisting its capture by the anti-corruption and human rights business persons. Okay? And then there is the struggle around engagement, because we're engaging a fast-moving train, if you like, the multilaterals, bilaterals, and so on and so forth, which is local, national, and continental. Valerie, you're talking about capacity, and at all levels, there are capacity deficits, which may be knowledge-related, which may be technical and institutional related, and so on, so that even when there's capacity, it reposits in individuals, not in structures and institutions that are able to replicate. And talking of that institutional and individual leadership merger, the bank has been offering assistance which is tied to assisting, if I like, I won't say states, but governments. And what happens with the rapid change of governments that's happening, that essentially means that people who are in government and assisted are no longer in government. So we have this cyclical and inexhaustible capacitation. Is there a sense of what the bank, because the ECA is the AMDC, and so on and so on. Are we now drunk with the multiplication of so-called Pan-African institutions doing the same thing? Is the danger of duplication also one that also means that we're split in terms of our delivery? And then mass struggle, Dawn. The women of Rwanda in 1994 after the genocide, they said, we asked for justice, you gave us more law. The women of Zimbabwe in 2005 said, we are glad that the courts gave us rulings. But once we were armed with rulings, it was like putting Band-Aid to a bleeding wound. we could not enforce the rulings of the court elsewhere. So this drive to litigate, we should name and shame. There is this, what is the enforcement? How do we get to enforce this? And then lastly, I worry when I sit in conversations like this about intersectionality and continuities of struggle, and that's my last one. So many in this room, because of your average age, may have been raised when we're talking reparations after the Durban Racism Conference. We talked about debt ahead of the 2000. I was one of the young activists addressing people at the G7 summit out in Canada. Trade, we were going to the 2005 plus 5 summit. We all were talking trade. I remember running around with Rungu and others. We're talking trade and aid, justice. Now we're in IFF. We've had this whole conversation. It's really about development finance. It's really about economic structural transformation. It's really about inclusive development. All these things. So it's like every time people want to loot, they give us something to focus on. It's like what I do with my dog. I throw it a ball and it jumps around to exhaust its energy. So my question, Jason, is really to you and to William and Co. Every time there is a problem that is about the contemporary underdevelopment of Africa, there is a reference to capacity, right? Yet the one time Africa was liberated, there were no capacity building workshops. It was through the liberation struggle, the anti-apartheid movement. Is it possible that we are now, not saying that capacity is not correct, we're dealing with partly criminal, partly immoral action, and we're building largely technical, amoral competencies to deal with a problem of immorality. It's like technically capacitating priests to address a moral problem. Thank you.
Merci, je vais essayer de poser ma question. Oui, je vous donne 5 secondes de porter le casque. Oui, merci. Je m'appelle Yannick, je travaille pour une organisation de la société civile. Je suis basé à Kinshasa. Je vais poser ma question et elle s'adresse principalement à Williams. Et là, je vais essentiellement aborder les rapports des hauts niveaux du groupe Mbeki. Je pense que cette délégation, vous êtes sûr avec moi qu'elle est passée dans beaucoup de pays en Afrique, même en République démocratique du Congo où je viens. Et quand ils sont venus à Kinshasa en 2013, ils ont parlé avec le gouvernement, les mouvements de la société civile et bien toutes les composantes de la vie nationale. Mais les révélations ont été très troublantes en matière de flux financiers illicites et plus particulièrement vers le secteur extractif, le secteur minier et je peux même combiner le secteur forestier où le rapport a indiqué que la République démocratique du Congo ne perçoit que 15% de la fiscalité qui vient dans le secteur minier. Et pourtant, c'est le secteur qui est à la base, qui est vraiment le poumon économique du pays. Et par conséquent, le pays perd 85% des recettes. Alors, dans la présentation que vous avez faite, je vois les progrès qui sont aujourd'hui enregistrés dans d'autres pays comme le Kenya ou le Ghana que vous citez. Alors, moi, je me demande, qu'est-ce que vous voulez dire par là? Est-ce que ces pays, c'est-à-dire le Kenya par exemple, ou le Ghana que vous avez cité, ce sont de meilleurs élèves par rapport à d'autres pays où cette délégation est passée? Et quelle est vraiment l'implication ou qu'est-ce que la division économique de la Commission économique des Nations Unies pour l'Afrique fait exactement dans ces combats de flux financiers illicites? Et quant au docteur Chabalala, je me rappelle quand on était au Nigeria en 2016, dans la 4e conférence panafricaine sur le flux financier illicite et la fiscalité. Il y avait quelqu'un qui a dit qu'aujourd'hui, pour arriver à stopper les flux financiers illicites en Afrique, il faut attaquer le terrorisme. Et moi, je me rends compte aujourd'hui que ça, c'est vraiment un aspect des choses très pertinent que vraiment on doit prendre en compte. Alors, moi, je ne vois pas comment ne pas associer la volonté politique dans tout ce qu'on est en train de faire aujourd'hui sur le flux financier illicite. Merci.
When I put my hand up, this is Asha speaking. When I put my hand up, it was going to be to respond and to ask 2 questions of Kanisile. I can call you Kanisile, right? But now I feel like I do need to respond a little, just very briefly, to Brian. During the anti-apartheid movement, for us who are involved in non-violent struggle in the country, we didn't call it capacity building, but we certainly were trained. We were trained on how to build campaigns. We were trained on how to actually stand our ground and not run when we were attacked. We were trained on how to actually be prepared to die and not kill. By our own people, absolutely, by our own people. Oh, okay. But so we were definitely trained by our own people who were also trained by others who I understand now were trained in Algeria. So, you know, I'm not sure exactly where the training, you know, who trained the person who trained me and who trained that person, but there was training. And I think when we are building, so it links to what, you know, this is not completely, let me just stand on the subject, actually, because it's not completely unrelated to what I was actually going to say at the beginning. This training that we had was very important because it helped us define our objectives. It helped us distinguish between strategies and tactics. It helped us understand what were non-negotiable principles and what were principles that, you know, certain things that we were not prepared to negotiate on, and what we can actually compromise on because it's just tactical. There are certain things that are just tactical. And this is really, really important, I believe, for our conversation here. Because what we did in South Africa is we built a broad church. And I think a couple of days yesterday, somebody asked, I can't remember who it was, but somebody asked, do we all have the same objective? What are we working? I think it was Michael. I'm not sure. But I think it was Michael who said, what are we working towards? And I think, sitting here, this is my first time here, but I've engaged with a lot of people, and I don't think we all necessarily have the same ideological perspective. Some of us want to transform the entire economic system of the world. Some of us want to change certain things, and some of us want things to remain pretty much the same, but to share and, you know, it's like in South Africa, okay, right? Like in South Africa, where some people just wanted the color of capital to change, not necessarily the structure, the system of capitalism to change. They just wanted to be at the trough and to also share in the loot, right? I think what's really significant and what's really important for us right now, as we're talking about domestication and as we're talking about building campaigns and all of that, is for us to recognize this and not necessarily judge it. Because we do need a broad church. We do need a broad front that's actually comprised of a range of different ideological perspectives. But we need, as a common goal, to have something that draws us together in common. And I think going forward, that is what we need to define. We need to define clearly, if this is a war, what are we fighting? Who is on our side and who is on the other side? And we need to be able to accept that on our side, not everybody is going to share the same ideology, but we're all fighting the same battle, we're fighting the same enemy. So who is the enemy? What is it that we are fighting for? Not just what is it that we're fighting against. What is it that we're fighting for? Who can we build alliances with? And what can we absolutely not compromise on? What is this common thing that we're not prepared to compromise on?
Thank you very much. with that first round. I just may ask the panelists to quickly respond. I mean, there weren't any. Hello. Okay, cool. I'm just going to ask the panelists to try and respond to a lot of the very rich comments that have been made. Some were comments, not, and a few questions here and there. So I may start with William, and I'll move down this way to maybe kick us off.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jason. So in response to the first question regarding the lack of publications from African institutions saying that tax avoidance is part of IFF, I just wanted to note that the report of the high-level panel said that aggressive tax avoidance is part of IFF. In addition, ECA published 2 reports earlier this year, both of which clearly stated that multinational tax avoidance should be considered as part of IFF. The titles are Base Erosion and Profit Shifting in Africa and a Study on the Global Governance Architecture for Combating Illicit Financial Flows. In terms of the the need for a common African position on tax issues and also further research definitely agree, and the common African position definitely agree, and it speaks to the need to elevate the discussion on tax to the highest levels of the AU intergovernmental process. On the CFTA. And the use, possible use to affect IFFs. This is something that we brought to the table in the meeting of African ministers of finance, economy, and planning that was held in Addis Ababa in May. And you can see in the issues paper that it's discussed there. I agree that it's definitely something that needs to be looked at. In terms of monitoring who is complying, who is not. The AU Assembly of Heads of State and Government mandated His Excellency Thabo Mbeki to report on an annual basis to them on the progress that African countries were making in implementing the recommendations of the high-level panel. While it's not explicitly there to name and shame, it still will highlight what has been done and what has not been done. Brian's question, a technical solution to a moral problem. Yes, I certainly agree. And multinationals and perpetrators of IFFs and secrecy jurisdictions should all stop plundering Africa. Do we think that they are going to stop? As long as we don't think that they are going to stop, Africa needs to defend itself. And in order to do that, in line with what Asha was saying, it needs the tools and the techniques to defend itself. For Yannick's question on the countries and whether they are the meilleurs élèves, no, the point of reviewing those countries was just to see overall what progress has been made in implementing the panel's recommendations. In terms of what the ECA is doing on supporting the struggle against IFFs, we're working on a forthcoming report that will look in detail at institutions needed to tackle IFFs. We're also supporting the consortium to stem IFFs in Africa and working on 2 projects to build national capacities for national estimates of IFF and also to identify and prevent trade misinvoicing. And that's all from me.
Thank you. I think I will actually respond to 2 of the questions. One was yours, why we aren't redefining for ourselves, and you made the example of tax evasion versus tax avoidance, because, I mean, both of them are a form of illicit financial flows. We have the African Tax Administration Forum. Whether it will grow and migrate, I think, again, it depends on cooperation of our governments. But also, they are not redefining, that is another thing, because the research and everything on this is not homegrown. So perhaps the discussion we need to be having also is how we are going to invest in our own homegrown research, but it links with the media again, because we also don't have our own homegrown media to cover these things. 86% of the world media is owned between 6 companies. For me, that's a serious concern. Then, Brian, are we drunk with African institutions doing the same thing? I will say yes or no. I'll be like Dominic on this one. I'll say yes or no. Yes, in a sense that the synergy is very little and we need the synergy. But no, because these messages have to be repeated over and over, because it's an area that you find sometimes even MPs, sometimes even ministers of our countries don't even know what is illicit financial flows. So it's a message that must keep going on. The only dilemma is I hope that we are empowering to action, because you can't be empowered for the sake of being empowered. So action must start being attached to these things, Jason, now going forward. Like I gave a template to my MPs when we meet next year, this time they need to take the template and say what have we achieved. So maybe we need to develop some similar things so that we don't come back here every year and we are just talking. People need to say this is what I have done. For you, Brian, again, why I said yes and no. You see, if you look at that map, again, these people meet every year. So our enemy is always a step ahead of us. They meet every year in a meeting called the Bilderberg meeting, which is a secretive meeting. As a matter of fact, we are grateful to alternative journalism, because they are the ones who are trying to cover it and tell us what were the topics under discussion. And the topics under discussion are the very things we are talking about in this room. So they have one leverage above us, because they can get together, they have the money every year and say, okay, what's our counter strategy? So we don't have a common, that's why I said there's no pull through. For us, you can't call us into one room and say from Cape to Cairo, what are we discussing? You can't do that with our citizens. You can't do that with our CSOs. Sometimes CSOs end up competing amongst themselves, because we know their money comes from the same coffers, who are the same coffers that are exploiting us. So, and then Asha, just quickly, who is the enemy? I think they have declared themselves. I don't think we should really go into semantics and start redefining who the enemy of Africa is. We are not in the United Nations Security Council, so clearly our elimination there said we are not part of us. We are not in the Bilderberg meeting. By the way, we are the only people excluded in that meeting. Asia and Europe attend. We are the only ones excluded. We are the only ones excluded in the running of the World Bank. I mean, I made a presentation in the morning and I told people Germany and Britain alone carry a vote equal to 46 of African countries. So they've defined themselves. I think someone sent me something, and this is my last comment, Jason. Somebody sent me something when the year started and said, this year, Kanyisile, when people show you their true colors, believe them. Because if you don't believe them, you are the one who's stupid. They are showing you who they are. So I think it's high time we wake up and smell the coffee. They have declared themselves as the enemy. We are the ones who are having a hard time accepting that they are the enemy. So the problem is clearly with us. It's not with them. They know what they are doing.
Okay, thank you very much. Valerie?
So I'll touch on Adetola's point, a question where he asked whether African countries collaborate across board in such a way that can engineer competition that would drive compliance. Now, I'm aware of the African peer review mechanism, which basically seeks to ensure that African countries, or basically tries to measure in a very weak manner, I would say, the way African countries comply to money laundering regulations or money laundering laws and also corruption laws. Now, if you look at it, if you look at the reports from the African peer review mechanism, you would see that it's not detailed at all. It touches on different issues. Let's say, for instance, it goes to review Ghana. In Ghana, it touches on tax, it touches on a bit of corruption, a little bit here and there, and then it goes to Nigeria, and then it touches on totally different issues, and you're like, how do we then compare? So it doesn't give you that room to compare. or even say this country is more compliant than the other country. Additionally, there's the lack of enforcement. Now, if you look at the FATF and how it works, you would realize that the FATF can sanction countries. Now, why can the FATF sanction countries? Because one, it was started by the G7, who Doctor has called the enemies. So yeah, so it was started by the G7, but more importantly, it acts through certain institutions. It acts through the IMF, it acts through the World Bank. And these bodies come with a form of power that can actually hold countries accountable. Now, with the AU, you don't have that. You don't have an enforcement system that can hold bodies accountable. For instance, you can't see when Nigeria is erring and Kenya comes to say to Nigeria, oh, you're erring, we're going to sanction you. Nigeria will probably have a laugh and they're like, who are you to sanction us? Imagine our president, then President Obasanjo, who moved with such force. He'll probably have a laugh. And chances are that most of these institutions then get Nigerian leaders to man them. And in doing that, you're basically saying you can't hold us accountable. So if you can't hold one country accountable, how many other countries do you want to hold accountable? So to that extent, there's no competition as such between countries. So you see that at the international level with the FATF, countries where regulators from different institutions, supervisory institutions come together, and you see each regulator telling it, oh, I've done this, have you achieved that? The SEC in Nigeria is saying, I've done this. Have you, SEC Kenya, achieved it? Questions like that are asked, and then you then see a competitive push. But within the African Union, that push is not yet there. It's a work in progress, no doubt, but then it's not yet there. And should it be there, I would say yes.
Thanks, Jason. I agree entirely with Kanyisile and Asha and Brian that we as a people should articulate what we are fighting for first, the big picture. This is the world we want, and then everything else fits in there. And I would like to say that the AU Agenda 2063 goes a long way towards that. It was a culmination of many efforts of trying to say what is the world we want to see in its entirety, and then we break it down into aspirations and into targets and into goals and so on, and we see where everything fits in. It can be augmented for certain, but I think that was the whole aim. And I do agree with you, Brian, completely that it's been the same narrative we're dealing with different components as though it is the thing, but we should situate it in where it should be. And that would be my answer to you, Azinge. When you contrasted what I said yesterday to what I said today, when I said, you know, law is not our problem in that sense, in terms of getting action done. Remember, I'm quite clear in my mind that there are gaps in the law, which is why I'm saying even those things which right now we have not clearly proscribed and made them illegal. So all they are is immoral. Oh, how could you do that? But there's no offense. I'm saying let's make that offense. But also, I was just saying let's avoid a checklist approach, which lawyers usually fall prey to thinking that if I have the law there and if I have the institution, my problem will go away. It is important to have the law, it is important to have the institution, but be knowing that the problem that we're fighting is bigger, so that we have the other elements that we also need to do to avoid the prospect that Brian has showed us of people who are holding on to laws and hanging on to judgment and their life judgments from courts and their lives haven't changed. On HLP, if I were to just go, even though William said it, the IFF report, the HLP, the high-level panel report on IFF defines IFF according to Africa. It does. And the fact that the AU Assembly then adopted it makes it an AU Assembly decision. Because what you require more or less is a huge political shift in the mind that I am saying this is wrong. And this is an ongoing process. So I'm sure even if you look at the decisions arising out of the STC Finance, the annual meeting of Ministers of Finance of Africa, which took place earlier this year, you will see that the agenda is going on. If you see, for instance, the decision of the Assembly, the summit, after the media summit held in Nouakchott, they said there's a problem with how the world defines corruption. It leaves out many elements, and that should be worked on. So I think there's a journey. If you want to say that there's something you've seen, and as I say, as we also learned here, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is working on a human rights-based definition of IFF, which also shows the linkages between IFF and the violation of economic, social, and cultural rights. So I think there is a lot going on, and sometimes the fact that we don't know about it does not mean it's not going on, and sometimes the fact that we don't encapsulate it in our work means we are lacking, we are depriving ourselves of elements that we could use. African academics and think tanks, to the best of my knowledge, are publishing a lot on this issue. I'm not an economist, so I don't necessarily lead a lot of the economic part, but I know, for instance, my friend Atia Warris, who is a lawyer, a professor of tax law, does publish and has published long things on tax price, transfer pricing, criticizing the OECD BEPS model, saying it doesn't work for Africa and so on. Chinedu Nwaguhuzi and Amandine, who work for Trust Africa. Trust Africa funds the IFF Out of Africa database, which collects a lot of what is coming out of African academics, researchers, think tanks, and so on. And I think it's a very useful resource. Finally, on what is Africa doing, because I agree with you, there's a way in which we become big on rhetoric and small on action. Africa has a legal instrument establishing an African central bank. The same states that have very painstakingly negotiated it line for line are not ratifying it after adopting it. We have a legal instrument to set up an African monetary fund. We have a legal instrument to set up an African investment bank. We have a legal instrument around an African Institute of Remittances. That one, because they like the money, at least they've kicked it off, but with too little capacity for it to be transformational, but it exists. We have a common insurance pool, Africa Risk Capacity. We are members, not the only members, but we are members of the African Development Bank and of the regional multilateral development banks. There's a time I sat back and said, I'm not an economist. I'm more into democracy and governance, and we have the African governance architecture. But if you put all of this together, and the design was not in vain, we actually have an African finance architecture, which, with the all policies set under strong institutional bulwark, which will be what will answer, in our view, for our conception, for our Agenda 2063, how we want the world to be. So sometimes it's about us reminding ourselves that it exists, holding our governments to account on ratifying them and implementing them, and also holding ourselves to account. If my government has not made any ratification between this time and when we meet this time next year, then you're also entitled to ask me, okay, Donso, what have you been doing? Let's discuss that.
Okay, thank you. I will just add something, a question raised, another question, maybe some more on collaboration, right? What's his name? Brian? Yes. Yeah, in terms of collaboration. Yeah, from where we are just thinking that we're doing the same thing. It's it's out there, the opinion. But I think that for all these international institutions, of course, we have the same objective, but we are doing different things. And one thing I want to emphasize is when I mentioned the new policy of the bank to fight on the prevention of illicit financial flows, is one key element of that policy was it provides a basis to strengthen collaboration with international organizations. I mentioned maybe the OECD, World Bank, and AU, and all the regional bodies. We do a lot of work with ECOWAS, with SADC, and all that. And what is most important is fighting against illicit financial flow is very broad, and just not one institution cannot do the fighting, or maybe lead that fight. Again, also for a natural resources perspective, in order to improve the efficiency and the sustainability of the use of natural resource asset, I think collaboration is a must also in that ring. I also want to add something in capacity building. Where now we are just maybe looking at conceptualizing at the concept itself. We're tending now to get that capacity development concept, since we know that those in government people body, they're already capacitated by their own with the context we have. And one thing is a new development within the bank is we used to, I mean, a lot of activities that was intended to government official working with government. But for the last year, there's a lot of emphasis on working with civil society organization, media, parliamentarian. Just to say that we started this year talking at the center, talking with parliament on how we can assist them or in terms of capacity development on on natural resource governance, because we know that they have a key role on that area. Media also, I think that was maybe in this morning the discussion with the session, and I think those are maybe the key one for collaboration, multi-stakeholders and collaboration within all the different institutions. And maybe later, if you're allowed, I have something to add what the center is doing also.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just very conscious of time. We've got about 10 minutes to go. So I'll just take another round of questions. If you could please be as brief as possible, that would be great. So I'll start with Jamal. Then we'll go to Kwesi. And then we'll wrap up. Wait.
I want to propose that Brian's question next year or in another forum or so, that we devote a session to that. The thing about the capacity, yeah. Because Brian, I agree with you on some part of it, on the implementation and why we don't implement what we've agreed on. But in terms of the narrative for us as African to capacity building, I don't think that was fair to African institutions. I'm talking here as an African citizen. We have two bureaucrats over there. And I just want to reflect on my experience as an African citizen 10 years ago when I was at the African Development Bank. We went to a post-conflict country, and there was a huge number of consultants. The government, when I ask in a capacity building, how many consultants do you have? They refer me to an American guy from the aid effective coordination unit, okay, to report on behalf of the African country. I think we've moved away from the men in suit, and now my suggestion is to talk about the political economy of capacity building, because here illicit financial flows is not in abstract. It's part of the work of the Agenda 2063, etc. It's a if we look at capacity building, we see the issues are Africans actually refuse to have these consultants who work with multinational corporations. It's what sort of enhancing of our capacity in terms of lawyers, accountants, etc., etc. I know that because there's little time. This is why I think what Brian said is really important, and it deserves a session to discuss the political economy of capacity of tax and illicit financial flows.
Okay, thank you. I'll be very brief. So I'm happy for any member of the panel to just reflect on this. So two things have come up, and the sense I get from both Donald and I think Dr. Kanyasile, it's a particular approach, a new approach looking at this. You would recall that early this year, actually specifically sometime last December, the Europeans published what they call the EU blacklist, essentially of tax havens. Strangely, you find countries on this continent that are nowhere near countries that are classified, that fit the classic definition of tax haven, being classified. And if you went back to the comment by the Minister of Finance of Namibia, for example, one of the targeted countries, I think you get a flavor of the anger and the distaste. And I feel that we are not tapping into that sort of response from our own governments. With respect to the targeting by the very people, the very institutions, the very establishments that are actually facilitating this whole issue of IFS. So I think I would want somebody to reflect on this. And mind you, it was also tied to some of the EU Plus frameworks because they have not signed up to some of those. And I think it's important for, I'll be happy to hear somebody refract some of the conversation we've had through the lens of what is happening with respect to the target of some of our own countries that really don't fit the definition of tax havens. Thanks.
Hello. All right, thank you so much. Perhaps one point of entry, we've been discussing our legal architecture, but we should also take cognizance of the fact that while we are encouraged to go the road, treaty, and regulations, the weakness of international law is implementing those treaties. And the IFF phenomena is thrived through multinational companies. And now we know that international law in that regard is very weak. We are now having the Ruggie principle. How do we tap into that and infuse the illicit financial flow question in case that will one day have teeth? Now, we should be pushing to ensure that the extraterritoriality obligations of companies in home state take into account the issue of illicit financial flows by their companies in Africa and other places, because they will want to sue those companies only if they violate a first-generation right, like the right to life directly, or the Yukogen's right. But we need to be pushing for that responsibility to also capture the issue of IFF, corruption, and socio-economic right protection that are violated by these companies. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Tafadzo. I work for Zimcode. I think the discussion around the compliance and the progress being made in implementation of the high-level panel recommendations got me thinking that why are we at this level where our governments are not able to meet their own commitments? They make commitments, they don't adhere to them, and then even at national level, they even violate their own constitutions. And as citizens, we have a task to put them a task to ensure that they adhere to the constitution that they come up with. But if you look at some of the imposed policies, like the structural adjustment programs, I think many African governments, they adopted the structural adjustment programs during the end of 1980s into 1990s without being pushed. And they complied to most of the conditions that were put forth. So my question to the Economic Commission for Africa and probably the AU, do we have frameworks for ensuring that our governments comply with the commitments that they would have made at the African Union level? Thank you.
Ouais, merci pour la parole. Député angolais, Albert Xavier Lubota. Tout à l'heure, j'étais en train de réfléchir sur la suggestion donnée par Madame Dr Shibalala en disant que nous devons être conscients que c'est une lutte au point d'aller démissionner comme député. Il y a un principe politique qui ne changera pas, c'est que la politique, la chaise vide n'a jamais donné. Je pense qu'au lieu d'être démissionné, je dois continuer à être là pour continuer la lutte. Mais ça, c'est juste une introduction pour dire que moi, je pense que la solution pour nos lois ou nos décisions que nous avons prises dans le panel passé, qui ne sont toujours pas appliquées, et que partons du principe que l'Afrique, les lois, il en a toujours eu. Les lois, nous en avons toujours. Mais ce qui pose problème, c'est leur application. Et mon abordage est purement politique. Leur application, raison pour laquelle, à mon humble avis, les plus grands absents de nos rencontres, parce que nous avons la société civile, nous avons les députés, les plus grands absents, à mon avis, c'est nos gouvernements et le président de nos partis politiques. C'est un élément très très important parce que finalement, le gouvernement qui n'applique pas ce qu'ils assument, pour que nous les députés, nous sommes de simples législateurs, de simples concepteurs de lois. Mais que valent ces lois s'ils ne sont pas appliquées? Mais le gouvernement et nous les députés, nous sortons tous de nos partis politiques. Signifie, si le président de nos partis politiques sont aussi invités dans ce genre de rencontres, et quand je dis parti politique, tant le parti au pouvoir que le parti d'opposition, eh bien, à mon avis, ceci pourra déjà être un pas sur la solution, parce qu'à ce moment-là, les présidents des partis politiques peuvent influencer leur parti à avoir dans le programme des sociétés, introduire déjà ces nouvelles lois qui sont les FFI, et j'en passe. C'est ça le vrai problème. J'étais tout à l'heure en train de réfléchir, moi qui suis dans un parlement de 220 députés, avec 150 députés qui sont du parti au pouvoir. J'étais là en train de réfléchir, mais comment je vais arriver à influencer ces députés-là? Si cela ne passe pas par le principe qu'on connaît des partis politiques, un parti politique a un groupe parlementaire, et le groupe, donc premièrement, je dois commencer par convaincre mon parti politique, qui doit par ensuite convaincre, nous donner des orientations au niveau de notre groupe parlementaire. Et notre groupe parlementaire doit chercher à convaincre dans une masse de plus de 150 députés sur 120 pour qu'ils arrivent à accepter ces propositions de loi au niveau de la plénière. De ce qui est déjà une lutte immense que je ne sais même pas comment commencer. Donc, il est important, à mon point de vue, qu'on revienne sur un élément fondamental qui sont les déciseurs de nos décisions politiques. Ce sont les présidents de nos partis politiques. Et il est plus simple pour moi d'influencer les éléments des collègues de mon parti que d'aller influencer le Parlement là où nous avons une pluralité, une diversité des conceptions politiques et idéologiques qui, ce n'est pas évident de pouvoir arriver à des solutions. Donc, j'insiste et recommande, je me demande, parce que depuis qu'on a commencé, je n'arrive pas à voir un député kenyan, je n'arrive pas à voir un membre du gouvernement kenyan. Je me demande qu'est-ce qui se passe, parce que c'est des gens, effectivement, qui devaient être avec nous pour donner l'exemple du Kenya. Donc, j'insiste sur l'influence de nos partis politiques en invitant, en associant le président de nos partis politiques, parce que c'est là que d'où nous venons, tant nous les gouvernements, nous les députés. Juste pour terminer, je voulais aussi insister pour dire que si nous arrivons à influencer nos partis politiques, ceci garantit aussi la continuité de la lutte. C'est-à-dire, demain je ne suis pas député, mais lorsque mon parti politique arrive à associer ses idées et ils font partie de leur projet de société, eh bien, le prochain député qui viendra va continuer exactement dans la même relance. Donc il est très important cet aspect d'inviter le président du parti politique pour essayer d'influencer nos idées en allant dans le sens de nos objectifs. Et pour terminer, ici on a parlé aussi des citoyens. Effectivement, le citoyen ou nous citoyens, nous avons un grand rôle à jouer. Je veux vous dire, celui qui est proche de la population, ce n'est même pas les députés, ce sont les partis politiques. Parce que les partis politiques commencent toujours à influencer d'abord la population avant d'arriver à avoir des députés. Donc, les citoyens doivent être aussi sensibilisés, et tout cela passe par le parti politique, pour que le citoyen comprenne les nouvelles idées qu'il faut avoir, notamment les agendas du continent, hein, pour qu'il arrive à sanctionner exactement les dirigeants qui ne respectent pas ou qui ne respectent pas les engagements du continent. Donc, il est tout à fait important, en insistant sur les partis politiques, qui doivent aussi introduire dans leur discours de campagne, dans leur discours d'éduquer la population, les agendas du continent. Merci.
Thank you very much for those statements, comments. I think what I'm going to do is, if I can start to my left with Salimata, as you give your response or any additional information you'd like to give to the participants, to make it as brief as possible, but also to have a concluding statement, because we are now totally out of time, and I'm going to start receiving messages for us to leave. So if you could just, if there was any additional comment you want to make in terms of what has been said, in terms of the session, and then just a concluding remark to follow that. Thank you very much.
Okay, I want to just quickly add, because yesterday I promised during the session that I will give more detail, more information about the study that the center has commissioned. That study on illicit trade of natural resources, which is going to be soon published. That study will help us to better understand the nature of illicit trade in natural resources. And they have a lot of key findings on the direct revenue loss and the indirect revenue loss. We do have also some findings on that the largest loss occur on combined extractive industry, on extractive sector, all those. And illicit trade is really symptomatic to a broader governance and transparency challenges. But what in terms of policy, what is one of the key policy recommendation was support to this international initiative to transparency, like the EITI, and also the Africa Mining Vision. The implementation of the Africa Mining Vision also came out as a key policy recommendation. It's just supposed to mention that maybe I missed that in my statement, that the ADB through the ANRC, the African Natural Resource Center, is an implementing partner of the AMV. So in particular, the development of the low-term national resource vision, we are assisting the regional member country to integrate mineral resources development policy into a broader national development plan. And we do have some different initiatives now ongoing, and that maybe we can share later on in another opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks. Just one point, triggered by the point the colleague raised about the EU grey list. Last week, our counterparts from the EU had organized a biannual policy forum for development, this time held in Gaborone, Botswana. And we raised that issue of the grey list with them very robustly, and we told them, we called them out on the hypocrisy of having a grey list with African and Asian countries who are doing only a fraction of what Ireland is doing, what Luxembourg is doing, what the Netherlands is doing. We did call them out. And we told them that being our major partner, the EU, we expect issues of IFF and issues of FFD, Finance for Development, to be at the center of the formal EU-AU dialogue and not outsourced to some body called the OECD, where we are at best invited guests. And I think really the answer for us, for Africa, for Asia, for Latin America on this point is have your own political leverage to reply in kind. We've talked a few minutes ago about the institutions that could make up an African financial architecture. Let's set up those institutions, the Monetary Fund, the Central Bank, and so on, who then will be able to superintend continental policy and be able to shore up the weak states and help fight this divide and rule that many times is raised to the bottom, that many times in between the summits we are put to. And then see what we can learn from our colleagues. in the EU, the Director General in charge of competition has come up with a unique way of using competition policy to punish the states that are setting up the tax havens and other legal, kind of legal gymnastics, and to punish them and exploiting, including with very huge fines. So when we're thinking of reforming the AU or what we can do with the Department of Political Affairs at the AU Commission, let's think of innovations such as that. The EU Parliament has come up with a way of summoning individuals and institutions to go and address them. They have no way of compelling them, but people go. A lot of people saw when they summoned Facebook on the issue of privacy in the context of Cambridge Analytica. But just a month later, they summoned McDonald's, they summoned Google on this issue of corporate taxation. So our Pan-African Parliament can do that now with the powers it has now. It just sets up a day and says we're inviting African citizens and any other person who has something to say to come and address us in a public hearing on this issue. And we will go and lay down what we have to say, which is what the European NGOs and trade unions did. And then the Googles and the Facebooks and the other peoples, you know, will have to come back and respond in kind. So I think build our own political leverage, especially around our own financial architecture.
Okay, my addition is that while we push for a Pan-African movement to fighting illicit financial flows, I kind of agree with Williams that we should also push for a truly global involvement, because it's one thing to set yourself aside, and it's one thing to not be involved, and it's another thing to set yourself aside from the global economy as a whole or the global financial architecture. And following on from this, I would like to add that I'd like to add that now change from within is possible, but then you would realize that when we're trying to change or revolutionize Africa from within, there are a lot of vested interest, political in some sense, and sometimes there's also the force of habit. We're used to doing things in a particular way. There's the big man culture in Africa. There are different things that work in Africa, and there's that force of habit where everyone just believes this is how things should be done. But then when there are external drivers for compliance, you then see African countries being forced to sit up. So we should be careful about pushing for just a truly Pan-African system that would push for compliance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think I'll respond to the one on MPs. MPs from Kenya do join us if it is a particularly MP training like it was last month. They were there. As to how political parties are going to be influenced, yes, they need to get involved. I fully agree. But also, I think for the members of parliament who are here, because you belong to those political parties, and if you belong to those political parties, it means you belong to branches of those political parties where policy decisions are discussed. So I think your input there is greatly required also. But also because you've got constituency funding, I think at your constituency level, start taking up this discussion with your constituency so that it's not just left at the political party, because in a case where they are not interested, what's going to happen? And we have had cases where they are not interested as a political party, but as an individual, you can still do that. But also, I think for me, the greater part that MPs can play is to start making the message of illicit financial flows and tax an electioneering campaign message. For as long as political parties campaign and say nothing about this and they get elected into power, it means the citizens have not migrated to realize that this is the agency of the situation. And I think just as a closing remark, I want to say the cognitive dissonance that we all suffer for being lied to for so much, I think we need to individually help each other and snap out of it. It is so easy, you know, self-hate of Africans bothers me. It is so easy for Africans to accuse one another and be so derogatory in the manner that we describe one another. But the 64% behind the IFFs, we even, in South Africa, I even argue, we call them with one name, white monopoly capital. But when we demonize Zuma or whoever, and we should, I'm not saying we shouldn't, we demonize them at individual level, including their wives, their children, and everything. When we talk about the 64%, they've got one nice name. transnational companies or white monopoly capital. So can we start dealing with our cognitive dissonance manifesting in self-hate and start tackling the actual enemy?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to reply to various questions about to what extent the decisions on IFF can be enforced. The first thing to say is that sometimes reporting and monitoring can be effective in driving change. And one example of this is in visa openness for travel of Africans to other countries. African Development Bank recently launched the Africa Visa Openness Report. During the process of producing that report, the government of Ghana got an advance copy and saw that they ranked low. And they immediately began to take steps to address the problem. And so by the time that the report came out, they had liberalized the visa regime for other Africans. Since the report has come out, we've seen a number of other African countries that have taken steps to liberalize their visa regimes for other Africans. But there may also be enforcement avenues that Africa can pursue. To my knowledge, there's no direct mechanism within the AU that can force countries to implement decisions on IFF. But there may be various other legal mechanisms that can be used. The African Court on Human and People's Rights might be one, given the impact of IFFs on human rights. But there may also be global legal mechanisms that can that African countries can make use of, or regional ones such as the East African Court. And so creative thinking to find links between existing legal frameworks and courts that enforce them and IFFs could be a strategy to push for somehow enforcement of IFF decisions. Yeah, that's all from me. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, it's been a very rich conversation, and I really appreciated the contributions by all our panelists. I don't want to try and summarize what has been said, but I think what is clear for me, having moderated this session and listened to the different contributions, is that there is a need for at least three things. One is what Valerie has said in terms of creating an environment where there is positive competition to force compliance on things that our governments have signed and committed to. The second is that there is a need for the multilateral system that is in play on the continent, not globally, on the continent, to start speaking to each other, because there are some great things that are currently happening or that are in place, at least on paper, as Don has mentioned. And last but not least, there is definitely what I believe maybe a general consensus on this panel and in the room that there is a need for an African narrative on this agenda on illicit financial flows and fighting illicit financial flows from this continent. And with those few remarks, I'd like you to put your hands together for this lovely panel, because they have been amazing. And a lovely round of applause for yourself, because your questions have been very provocative. Clap for yourselves, brilliant. And I'll invite you all now to have some tea for about 15 minutes, because we do have to reconvene for the last session. Thank you all very much.